You've probably heard of the word grief before. You may have experienced grief. You may be experiencing grief right now. And grief is often, but not always, associated with the loss of someone. However, there's a different type of grief. And that type of grief we can all experience, but that someone is still there. That type of grief is called ambiguous grief. And I think it's worthwhile exploring what that grief means and how it could impact me and you. To help us do that, I'm going to access a couple of articles, links in the description, what ambiguous loss is and how to deal with it. Now, immediately we can see here that the term is ambiguous loss rather than ambiguous grief. But as you'll see as we go on, loss and grief, well, I think they're interchangeable as far as the concept of this is concerned. It's been more than 40 years since family therapist Pauline Boss, PhD, first coined the term ambiguous loss and published her book by the same name. In its simplest sense, ambiguous loss refers to loss without closure. Now, that without closure part is important. And today the term has never been more relevant, especially as we continue grappling with the many ways the COVID-19 pandemic has upended our lives. Psychologist Kia Rai Pruitt, PhD, delves deeper into this concept, including its original meaning and how it's especially applicable today. What is ambiguous loss? Dr. Pauline Boss created this term to refer to a lack of information and closure that surrounds the loss of a loved one. So this lack of information, this lack of closure is so important, I think, in terms of understanding what is this ambiguous loss, and as we'll see, ambiguous grief. At its core, ambiguous loss is all about a lack of resolution, but Dr. Boss created categories to differentiate between physical and psychological loss. So let's take an example of a physical loss from this article. An unexplained disappearance could be a kidnapping. And if people don't know what's happened, then there's no resolution. And yet they can still feel, obviously, very intense negative emotions. But also, they can fall into, in some ways, a type of grieving, but it's a grieving for many people, tragically, without closure. That's a type 1 physical loss where we don't know what's happened. The person we hope is still around, but we don't know. There's no closure. And then we get on to something which I think is, for most people, likely to be a little bit more common. And this is called type 2, surprisingly enough, ambiguous loss. This type of ambiguous loss refers to a psychological loss, including a mental or emotional disappearance, like when someone's personality has changed so much that they no longer seem like the person you once knew. Dr. Boss describes it as psychological absence with physical presence. Your loved one is physically present, but they've changed, whether emotionally or cognitively or both. Examples include changes caused by Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, traumatic brain injury, drug and or alcohol addiction, depression or other chronic mental illness. I'm going to skip to this article briefly again, just to get another angle on this loss, this grief, and then we'll come back to the article that I've just been reading from. So this one by Stephanie Sarrazin, MPP, what is ambiguous grief and how to begin healing? Death isn't a prerequisite to grief. Common life events activate grief ambiguity. Absolutely. For me, we've jumped ahead in the article here, even Dr. Boss's impressive body of work, this Pauline Boss that I talked about already, and the expanded work of others was close but not quite to what I was personally seeking. Through further exploration, I identified that it wasn't my loss that was ambiguous, but my grief. So you see here that someone has done, in a sense, what I did when I first read about ambiguous loss, and said to themselves, well, my experience of it is more like grief. And I think ultimately this is a better, well, let's say in certain circumstances is a better descriptor. I longed for the insights of those who understood the nuances of this ambiguity from starring in the role themselves. Additionally, not unlike the search for my children's paediatrician, where I wanted a practitioner who was also a parent, I saw insight into this grief from those who had personally experienced it and know the painful reality of life in the nameless space of not quite widowhood. Again, this is from personal experience that the writer is quoting here. Whether I could find these people or not, at my core, I knew I needed to learn how to navigate the ambiguity of my grief. And I mention at this point, as I often say, I'm not going to go over every part of these articles, but again, from those links, you can get the broader story from each of the authors. Ultimately, this independent study revealed more than I anticipated, most notably that an overwhelming percentage of the population is likely to experience an ambiguous grieving process at least once in their lifetime. Yet few know that this grief has a name, much less how to deal with it. It's one of the reasons I think it's important to share this stuff. Are you experiencing ambiguous grief? Being able to name the ambiguous grief process in yourself and others is an important step towards healing. Absolutely. To determine if you or a loved one are experiencing ambiguous grief, consider your answers to the following 5 statements. You have experienced a significant relationship loss and your loved one is still living. 2, you have hope that your lost loved one will return to you as they once were, or that the relationship will be restored to what it once was. 3, you find memories of the loss of the relationship occupy your thoughts. 4, I think this is meant to be you feel disconnected from yourself or others because of the loss. You feel as though this loss has made it difficult to move forward in your life. Like all loss, the intensity and frequency with which you experience these statements are unique. If you answered yes to 2 or more, it could be helpful to discuss your loss and how it is impacting you with a professional. I would always encourage people to seek help, whether it's one or whether this gets you to think about something that is bothering you that may not even be connected to what I'm saying. Reach out, talk to someone. And again, where possible, if you think it's relevant, then get professional help. And even if you're not sure, it's worth discussing. So why ambiguous loss is so hard to handle. Now we're back to the first article here. Usually, closure is an important piece of the complicated puzzle that is grief. It provides us with some ways to process what's happened. We typically crave closure because our brains are wired to analyze information and our environment, Dr. Pruitt explains. When someone dies of known causes, even when it's sudden or particularly traumatic, we are at least able to comprehend that a loss has happened. Death is concrete, but ambiguous loss doesn't offer any sense of closure. And consider that idea of when someone dies of known causes, even if it's sudden, we're at least able to comprehend how many times when we go through a period, let's say it's someone that is quite widely known and we don't know what happened to them, we don't know how they met their demise, what caused it. There is that sense for a lot of people of wanting to know, not because they're really interested in some ghoulish or gruesome, potentially, facts, but it is a sense of closure. And that's someone that we don't know. How ambiguity impacts the grief process. I see ambiguous loss as a type of complicated grief. So then we now have both of these authors using the word grief, and I couldn't agree more. I think it is grief. Dr. Pruitt says, you're often left longing for what used to be or for answers to questions. Grief looks different for everyone, and there's no one right way to grieve. Absolutely. That's important to bear in mind. If somebody trots out to you these stages that I'm going to read, then don't for a second think that it will necessarily be in that order or that you will experience every one of them. You may have a totally different experience, but it's common, back to the article, to move through 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. People who are grieving a loss go in and out of these stages of grief in no particular order. But when you've experienced ambiguous loss, you may become stuck in any one stage. This is sometimes referred to as frozen grief or grief limbo. And I think that also refers to grief generally, but I would suspect that with ambiguous loss, ambiguous grief, that ability to become stuck, or that tendency to become stuck, is probably more common because of that lack of closure, that lack of full understanding. It can feel like an ongoing trauma because there is no answer, Dr. Pruitt says. Yeah. And if you're experiencing type 2 ambiguous loss or grief, other people may not even recognize that you're grieving at all. Important to bear in mind. So if that's you or it's someone else around you, consider that perhaps all is not as it may seem on the surface. Ambiguous losses can feel isolating because they can be ignored, Dr. Pruitt says. This makes it especially difficult for the person experiencing the loss. They can be ignored in the sense that the individual is around. Again, with this type 2 loss. Type 1, we don't know where they are. But again, that sense of loss and grief is still there. So tips for coping with ambiguous loss. If you're experiencing ambiguous loss, here are some suggestions for dealing with the grief, stress, and sadness that can accompany it. Name what you're going through. The kind of ambiguous loss brought on by the pandemic in particular can be a sneaky kind of loss. You might not even recognize your grief for what it is, but now you have a name for it. Sometimes just being able to put a label on what you're experiencing can help you begin healing. 2, work toward acceptance. Acceptance isn't the same as closure, but in the absence of closure, Dr. Pruitt says it is important to try and make peace with this new reality. I think that's very important. That's really good advice. We can't get closure in those circumstances, but we can accept. Not necessarily easy, but it is important to do, if at all possible. The article goes on. It takes work to accept that things are different and may never go back to the way they used to be, she adds. Yeah. Reach out for support. Number 3, depending on the circumstances of your loss, other people in your life might not realize that you're struggling, which can be especially isolating. So again, that echoes what I would instinctively, intuitively say. Definitely reach out. Dr. Pruitt recommends identifying and connecting with family or a close friend who can help support you. And especially in pandemic times, again, this is written a couple of years ago, I think, you may be surprised to learn that they're having similar experiences. These days, you may be not surprised to learn that people are experiencing all sorts of different things because of the state of the planet right now, and there is this echo and knock-on effect from a couple of years or so back. But we don't know that unless we reach out and talk. And having someone go, yeah, I know what you mean, or oh, hey, I think that as well, can be extremely powerful and affirming and make us feel less isolated. You can also look for a support group or people who've experienced the kind of loss that you have. And number 4, look for silver linings without veering into toxic positivity territory. Is there such a thing? Yeah. Yes, definitely. I'm gonna do this crazy stunt. It's a bungee with an invisible rope or cord, or bit of elastic, but I'm assured it really is there. But just being positive will help. What has come your way, like new friendships or personal growth, that wouldn't have if your life had stayed the same? And I think that's so important. So essentially, this idea of when we are in a particular situation, that situation is a timeline that we're now on. And on that timeline, what's different that's positive, that wouldn't have happened? And it's not to say that the positive stuff outweighs the loss, but looking for silver linings can help us get back into some kind of equilibrium. It can feel overwhelming and disheartening to know that things won't go back to the way they were, Dr. Pruitt says, but it can also be an opportunity to create new meaning for yourself or with others. Absolutely true. Number 5, sort of bouncing off that last point, get involved in a cause. Some people cope with loss through action, like joining organisations focused on different issues that have personal meaning, Dr. Pruitt says. And if you choose to get involved with an organisation related to the loss you've experienced, say an Alzheimer's charity, if your loved one has dementia, or a relief organisation if you've lost someone to a natural disaster, you may also end up connecting with other people who've been where you are. And you get some meaning and purpose, potentially, that may be missing. Number 6, be kind to yourself. Try giving yourself grace and gentleness as you work through your grief. This is a time for self-compassion, Dr. Pruitt encourages. Be kind to yourself when you're struggling with difficult emotions, the same way you would provide compassion to someone else if they were experiencing what you are. And you may well be one of those individuals who tends to beat yourself up the most, who expects perfection from you, but is forgiving to those around you. So be kind to yourself, I think, is very important. And when to ask for help. If you find you're having trouble coping, look for a therapist who can help you work through your pain. It may be best to search for a therapist who specialises in grief or who has training in a particular type of loss you're experiencing. Often that's true. That's good advice. But you don't have to deal with ambiguous loss on your own. And I would add, it is much more common than you may think. Maybe you don't think it's common, but it's surprising how many people think to themselves, it's just me. This is just a thing I've got to go through, or it's just my personality, or it's just my unique set of circumstances. But it is more common. And then I'm going to add my little bit at the end here. And you see, I think that the capacity for us not having closure and our capacity to try and make sense of our environment and to figure out why things happen can cause us to dip into something else. Now, you may or may not like this particular take on things, and I'm going to call it ambiguous grief at future lost. And I suspect that what might be a better way to describe that is ambiguous sadness, because grief may be too strong and maybe it's sadness. But let me stick with grief at the moment. Imagine that you sit and ruminate, and what you do is you find yourself getting overwhelmed, sad, but maybe even a more powerful emotion than sadness. Not necessarily all the time. What you're doing is you're ruminating about a decision that you made, or a decision that was made for you, or something that happened, and you start to consider those things that would have been different in your life on that particular timeline, not the one you're on now, but the one that could have been. And I know people who will really get in a rut about that, will really ruminate, as I've said, and focus and dwell, and to a degree find themselves stagnating in the sense that there's no energy to do many other things because they are preoccupied by that what if. Now, this can be called many other things, but I wanted to add it as part of this walkthrough of ambiguous loss, ambiguous grief, because I've seen it and I've certainly experienced it. And you may have experienced it as well, where you just get too hung up on what could have happened. And because it's the future that hasn't happened, but could have, and maybe is happening as you look across there to that other timeline, think, oh, yeah, I imagine somewhere there life is different, then we can get that same sense of no closure, of what ifs, as I've mentioned. Sadness can become grief, and that's what I'm saying. There could be ambiguous sadness of future loss, but it can dip into grief if we get overpowered by it, and we can get stuck in that loop, in that cycle of thinking. And one way to borrow from earlier on in that article that we can hopefully, if you find this is you, or perhaps you may dip into this in the future, to combat it is to consider what may actually have happened. Because when we think about that timeline that could have happened, well, how do we know that it would have worked out the way that we think? How do we know that that timeline wouldn't have been a catastrophe? How do we know that things wouldn't have come massively unstuck for other people, including possibly us also? And so we're on this timeline. We have to deal with the experiences that this timeline gives us. And so what silver linings are there? Looking around, there's an echo here to gratitude, of course. But gratitude gets diminished. The ability to do the gratitude exercise, to be grateful for those things around us, dissipates, evaporates if we're focused on what could have been, that other idyllic timeline, but it might not have been. And so to help us with that, what's good about things as they are right now. And another way to think about this, just to add I suppose a little bit of, let's say, interest at the end of this video, if you're still here, is that I remember a few years ago, it was I think it was a Doctor Who episode, and it was about the weeping angels. Remember them? And apparently, I'm probably mangling the sci-fi logic, but apparently they could take people back in time, and when they did that, they fed on the quantum blah 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 jingle jangle oobly boobly energy of that individual not having lived the life they were going to live. So they take them from 1999 and put them back in time, and so that individual who was 20 could have had another 80 years that didn't happen in that timeline, and these angels feed on that, and that gives them energy. Not very nice. But I think what we can do is we can look at points in time and say, oh, from 1999 or last year or whatever, but for the years between 99 and now, or from last year and now, rather than feeding positively, we get drained negatively as we consider the what could have beens. So we need to be the opposite of those energy, time, quantum vampires, stroke angels. And I guess it leaves me to suggest that, like all things in life, there are always challenges, and the idea about gratitude and silver linings and reaching out to people and connecting and getting meaning and purpose and getting involved in a cause, all of those things are healthy anyway. And they're definitely healthy if you're experiencing grief, and they're definitely healthy if you are experiencing ambiguous grief. Life is for the living. It is short for all of us in relative terms, and so I guess it's important to, don't blink.